Scott Macmillan is a musical monster, instrumentalist, composer, conductor, arranger, impresario, and teacher. He's able to do all this because he's married to the remarkable Jennyfer Brickenden, manager, organizer, businesswoman, and collaborator. Together, they are a cultural force to reckon with. Scott Macmillan seems equally at home with jazz and gospel and Celtic and classical forms. For me, though, his most powerful and engaging work fuses Celtic melody with classical structure. His early group, the Octet, combined 4 symphony players with 4 Celtic musicians to create a music that was by turns witty, poignant, innocent, dark, and dramatic. Although Celtic culture is often disregarded as regional and peripheral, it is a vast and powerful tradition. Gaelic was Europe's 3rd great literary language after Greek and Latin, and Scott Macmillan's Celtic fusion music integrates the sensibility of this great culture into the classical repertoire. This is particularly true of the splendid Celtic Mass for the Sea, which blends the Mass form with Celtic texts and melodies. It combines a chamber string orchestra and choir with a Celtic ensemble of harp, pipes, mandolin, fiddle, and guitars. Jennyfer wrote the libretto based on ancient Celtic poems and prayers which exuberantly celebrate the life of the waters covering our planet, but also express an astonishingly modern concern for the health of the oceans. The most arresting line in the Celtic Mass, chanted over and over, is as contemporary as the collapse of the cod fishery. He who tramples on the world tramples on himself. Saint Columba wrote those words in the 4th century. You can watch a full performance of the Celtic Mass for the Sea on this website as a special presentation of the Green Interview. The piece is conducted by Jeff Jodrey, and Scott is in the front row playing guitar. Our conversation focused on the making of the piece and its remarkable worldwide acceptance.
Gaelic isn't trivial. It's as ancient and as important as the Greek and the Roman, although it was an oral culture, so it wasn't a written culture. So that may explain why people think it's a little less important. But I was fortunate enough, we were fortunate enough to meet Sister Margaret MacDonnell, who was a Gaelic scholar teaching at St. X at the time when we put the music and the piece together. And she directed me and us to 2 specific research areas, and one was a set of volumes called the Carmina Gadalica that was researched and by Alexander Carmichael back in Scotland in the early 1900s. And what he had done is he went out to the Outer Hebrides in search of old religious lore, because throughout the 12th century, when the Roman Catholic Church had decided that the way it was going to work was you're going to take on their prayers and their way of doing things, a lot of the Celtic prayers sort of went underground and went into people's recesses of their memories, but we're still there. And Carmichael was fortunate enough, when he did his collection, to gather 7 volumes of these ancient incantations and prayers and mythologies that were still in people's memories. So that became the crux of much of the text that I did. And Sister Margaret also suggested Marjorie Kennedy Fraser, who was a collector of music, and she put out a series of music volumes, Songs of the Hebrides. Her collections, the Songs of the Hebrides Volume 1 is what I got a hold of, and it was published in 1909. And so she too went out and found a lot of these old melodies. Many of these melodies are common today. If you're involved with Celtic music, you would recognize these melodies. So between those, and then I was really lucky at the time, because at Dalhousie University, they housed a huge collection of all sorts of the old poetry and Irish, Scottish, English folk collections. And so I went in there and I found lovely ancient Irish monastic poetry. And between it all, I had the kids, and I would take them with me in the morning, and we would have their Legos and their little toys, and I would set them off, and they would go and do their thing, and I'd scan the book stacks and grab all of these books and come home, and I would speed read these books at night and highlight anything that I thought, salmon, fish, shells, anything that was ocean related. And then I did that for a week and managed to collect about 100 pages myself. At that point I just stopped because it was like a Pandora's box. You could just keep going forever and ever.
So you tapped into a huge treasure trove and really only were able to use a small amount, only needed a small amount, really.
Oh, yeah, a huge treasure trove, and really fortunate because I think since I did that in '88, the universities have sort of, in Nova Scotia, have sort of highlighted their libraries. Like now St. Mary's has the whole Irish collection, so I don't know if it would be as successful as I was then when all the collections were all in one place.
Okay, so yeah, so the resources have moved around a bit.
Yeah. And I was also really lucky because Alexander Carmichael, the way he put the Carmina Gadalica together, he collected it all in Gaelic and then he metrically translated it in English. Now that may have had some issues with Gaelic scholars because it wasn't, a perfect Gaelic translation, but what it did do is it worked so well musically and fit on much of Marjorie Kennedy Fraser's music that she collected. So there's a number of occasions where I have taken text from the Carmina Gadalica and found music relevant in meter from Marjorie Kennedy Fraser and been able just to slide one right on top of the other.
And you're telling me that Carmichael went out there after 8 centuries, and people still had these ancient Celtic poems, prayers, incantations, and so forth, preserved orally for 8 centuries.
For 8 centuries, yeah, I think so. And I think with the oral traditions, I know that in the storytelling tradition, they would gather people together, and they would often cite a young person, and that person may be taking an interest in a story, and they would give that person the story. So they would learn these stories, and they would learn them verbatim. They weren't arbitrary. They weren't like sort of, I went down the street and I saw so-and-so, and then I passed that on to you, and then you went down the street and saw somebody else. These were very, very intact. And so I would assume that the incantations and prayers would also be kept intact. Like many oral traditions, we find that with Native communities. We find that all over the world where oral traditions are passed on very, very succinctly from one generation to the next.
Yeah, and very carefully unchanged.
Very carefully unchanged.
Like they are literary texts, and they're just as fixed as a written text.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate the way we've used the word illiterate, which has been applied to many of these cultures, because really illiterate just means unlettered, but certainly not without its succinct.
Now, for me, one of the most powerful lines in the Mass is "He who tramples on the world tramples on himself," which is supposed to come from what, Saint Columba, 4th century?
It was attributed to Saint Columba in the 4th century, I think 497, and yeah, it's quite prophetic when you look at that he was saying, and I don't know the context by which he said that in those days, but yet it's very relevant as we go through our current state of affairs. And it was also really interesting that Chief Seattle in 1892 also said a really similar thing. He who tramples on the web of the world, tramples on himself. It was not quite like that, but Chief Seattle also said. So you have these parallel cultures that have come down through history, through time, who obviously saw ecology in its, maybe not in our modern scientific terms, but certainly saw the relevance and the importance of caring for one species to protect another. Maybe it was for food, for the survival of the community, but there was certainly an acknowledgement that it had to be cared for.
Well, to me, that's the striking thing about that phrase, because what that tells us is that there was a problem in the 4th or 5th century with environmental abuse, right? Essentially.
essentially, or starvation or whatever it was going on. To try to, I mean, the land in Scotland and Ireland is rough land for growing, so the use of seaweeds and the use of trying to nurture the soil and to make it happen, and the identification of microorganisms. There was a reference in Gaelic in one of the songs that I found that actually refers to plankton as being, the big, the source of life. And this goes one of the oldest of the Gaelic songs that has been found. So there was certainly an acknowledgement that small microorganisms in the ocean were very important to the survival and the well-being of the communities.
Mm. Tiny plant life keeps us living.
Tiny plant life keeps us living.
Seaweeds till we reach our landing.
Yep.
Food and drink and tiny plant life on swelling oceans.
That's right. And that was originally in Gaelic.
That's astonishing.
It is. Yeah. It makes you realize that people knew things instinctively and looked around themselves and knew how fragile their existence was in relationship to the food that they could acquire either by land or by sea, and that without that give and take, then they put themselves in a much more precarious situation.
We've been here a long time, and sometimes we've been paying attention. Scott, let me turn to the second big word, which is mass. And I think many of us are familiar, or think we are, with forms like sonata and symphony and other similar concerto and so on. But mass doesn't seem nearly so familiar. What is a mass? What is a musical mass?
Well, if a person wants to compose a mass, they have to have 5 movements. They need a Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and an Agnus Dei. Got to have those 5. And then within that, there's a procedure called trope, which essentially you can open it up and add other things. And tropes were used a lot through Renaissance times, where you could, in between, have another movement, because if you have the 5, you can call it a mass. So that's what we've got here. There's those 5 movements are indeed in the piece, and then with this trope idea, then we open it up to all of the other movements of the piece.
So in a sense, that's kind of like the structural container for the mass, the 5 movements.
For the whole thing, yeah.
And then the places where you're allowed to branch out, become more creative, or whatever.
Exactly.
Are in the tropes. Yeah.
And it's sort of centered around the first reading and the second reading, which, when a person goes to a mass, the only thing that makes one mass different from the other are the readings. So that's why an hour Celtic Mass for the sea, those 2 movements really zone in on the ocean and the creatures, much more than the other ones.
But the mass form actually reflects the religious mass, right? I mean, the structure of the musical mass is based on the structure of the liturgy?
Yes, and Jennyfer and I, we discovered a little book called Understanding the Mass. It was a little leaflet in the back of the church, and it was really nice that we found that, because it defined the prayers. The Gloria says this, the Credo says this, like actually in a sentence. Oh, okay, that's so. Then when we're putting the words together and Jennyfer was building the text, she could take her discoveries and put something together that says that says that.
Yeah, the Gloria would be a reaffirmation of faith. The Agnus Dei would be a love song to God. And
so in that sense, it gave Jennyfer a real easy definition of what the prayers say, and gave her a good through line.
Now, is there a musical echo of that the musical structures or the melodic lines have to be of a certain type for each of those structures?
No, that was wide open. Now, so musically, the words and the superimposition of those words on those Gaelic melodies a lot of that Jennyfer had put together before I even started writing anything. And so what my job was, I took those pieces, and they weren't complete, but they were really strong. So often I'd take a beginning of a Gaelic melody, and the words might give me half or three-quarters of it, but then I had to spin on and finish it and create my own music coming out of that and going into it too. So the through line musically took those structures. The entire structure was pretty well laid out before I started putting pencil to paper. And so it kind of just revealed itself to me. When I was left with a sentence and I ran out of notes, well, I had to get some more notes, and plus sometimes I had to add and, you know, really sort of work it around. It's like kneading bread.
Too many notes, Mozart. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it sounds as though the whole thing is built on a bedrock of words, right?
Oh, yes.
You start off with the poems, and then you found music that went with the poems, and then you've taken what Jennyfer's got and welded that into an overall structure.
Yeah, and a few things were a big help for me. I had a friend that introduced me to a strathspey. I needed a strathspey. I needed a reel. There's certain things that I needed. And out of those tunes, I did the composer's thing, stretching them, turning them upside down, and turning them backwards and seeing what you get. And so that kind of stuff is lurking in the background in the piece, which instantly gives the listener continuity even if they don't know it, which is...
Well, when you say you needed those particular forms, you know, strathspey, reel, why did you need them? Like, what generates the need?
What? Well,
and maybe why not? You know,
well, He Who
else,
Tramples,
right? Mm-hmm.
at that section of the introit, it was... I need a fiddle tune. I need I don't know, well, that's just rhythms, but I needed the pitches. So I need a fiddle tune. So the fiddle tune that appears there is an Irish traditional reel, but that tune appears early in the movement as a 3/4 waltz figure against my own original melody. That it's a counterline. So some of the counterlines appear in different places because I just needed it.
Okay. So the need is a need that you have as a composer, seeing that in a sense you're building the structure.
Yeah.
And here's something, there's a requirement to put something like here.
Yeah.
And that's what it needs to be.
then for instance, in the Benedictus, I needed a jig. So I composed my own jig. So out of that jig came that. But then also I needed a strathspey. And I was directed to a nice, interesting strathspey, which is an Irish strathspey, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but nonetheless, on the east coast of Ireland, there was influence on the music from Scotland. And I got a really nice little strathspey at the beginning of the Benedictus. And so I took that melody and stretched it out longer, and that was the basis for the Sanctus.
I can remember the glee of when I was in your attic workshop here when you were working on this thing. I can remember the glee with which you gave showed rather a dreamy piece, and then said, "And now," and in came this red hot fiddle tune. You know, and every time I hear that passage in the Mass, I think of that almost wicked glee that you had when you did that. This is an old form, and it's been done by a lot of great composers in the past, but it's never been sort of a central form. It seems like it's been a little out to the edge of where musical compositions lie, and a little bit on a sort of a side pasture of the farm. And but there's also been some modern ones, and I'm interested in that. How many? Was this a form you were really familiar with beforehand? Had you been studying it at all?
No, not really, to tell you the truth. And the two of us had the pleasure of listening to Leonard Bernstein's Mass. And it's an enormous piece, an hour and 40 minutes long. And his music just spoke to me right away. Just the melodies, let alone what the words were, and the whole attitude of that piece was just, it was very inspiring for the both of us. And that's one place where we're introduced to the trope idea. In his Mass, there's all kinds of tropes. So, and plus I learned about that in music school years before, about tropes, but I didn't really dive into it in any seriousness. But then, oh, okay, well, if Leonard Bernstein can do that, we can do it too. But his music was really, really influential. That whole Mass of Leonard Bernstein's is gorgeous.
Well, to me, it's really interesting because you are in other places. You are a very contemporary composer, and this is there's an interesting blend in the Mass. It seems to me of a very contemporary sensibility and an ancient one, the ancient one that Jennyfer talks about. And there's a really interesting interplay between, you know, what you might do on your own, which would be very different from if you didn't have all this structure set up for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah? Well, it was a commission by CBC. CBC did commission, and it had to be a Celtic Mass. So the Celtic-ness of it was a given. So let's take that idea and just park that over there. We need Celtic. But then also my own ideas would be coming into it. So sometimes my own things would be used as counterlines against the Celtic, or I'd take the Celtic music and speed it up, or again do little tricks to it and turning it into something of my own. And
it was also defined as a Celtic Mass for the creatures of the sea. So it was always intended to have a environmental awareness component to it, right from the commission.
And that's what brings us here, really, because one of the themes in these interviews is that we have talked to a number of artists in various forms who have had environmental artistic statements that related to the environment, or that celebrated the environment, which I guess we could say about, say, The Currents of Sable is a piece that celebrates that reality. But this is a much more what's the word? It's a piece that's warning us. The Celtic Mass really does say pay attention, doesn't it?
It was tricky because you want to be able to give people an idea that there's a lot of issues out there, and people are aware for the most part that there are a lot of issues, but you don't want to get into the finger wagging, and you don't want to get into creating such a heavy hitting piece that by the end of it people are feeling downtrodden and unable to sort of see their own personal way of making changes in their own lives. So it became really, really important for us to be able to find a balance between giving a story about the creatures of the sea, giving a story about the environmental issues that may surround the oceans and the environment, and then also give a chance of empowerment at the end so people can walk away and feel, okay, that was really a lot of information, a lot of great music, but I think that I can go and do something. And that was a really, really important aspect of it for us.
It's a really important aspect of the whole environmental movement. I think it's easy to feel despair, and you don't want people to leave the concert hall feeling despairing.
No.
It's also not a particularly, I mean, in one respect, it's a deeply Christian form. And it's got these quite sternly prescribed features and movements to it. But this is not a particularly Christian Mass in a lot of ways. Christian Mass wouldn't start out, "To you, Eternal Mother."
Well, much of the text does predate the 12th century. It's Christian, not Scott and I aren't overly religious in the strict sense of the word, but this was a commission, so we did have to fall into this format. So, I mean, basically, you have to do what you're given to do.
But in a way, what we've got here is a structure that's very Christian and traditional, and in it, a sensibility that is not particularly traditional Christian. I mean, for example, that whole preserver, destroyer.
You could say that comes out of the pagan tradition or the pre-Christian tradition. Sure.
Or it's Shiva.
Or it's Shiva.
I mean, I think there's a broadly religious sensibility here that isn't narrowly Christian. It often brings in other things, branches in other directions.
We had one experience where the script was well, 99% in place. And we took it to a priest friend of ours.
Irish priest.
Irish priest who was, I would venture to say, quite conservative in his outlook, and handed it over to him. What do you think of this? And he was just delighted. He was speaking to him the way that, so that was a really important moment in this whole project, was taking it to him and see what he thought of it. So his conservative attitude to Christianity, with these other words from wherever they came from, spoke to him directly.
It's a profoundly reverent piece. I mean, I think from any tradition you would have to see that.
Yeah.
What other reactions have you had from religious people about it?
They seem to like it. Really.
Yeah, I haven't run into anyone that has really been in conflict with anything that is in the piece. It's actually been really incredible, the kind of comments that we have gotten from people, because it has really spoken to people on a really guttural level, and I almost sort of akin it to, you know, man's primal, fire. When we go have a bonfire or a campfire or a fire in our living rooms, you know, we're drawn to that, and there seems to be, maybe it's the ancient text, maybe it's the ancient music that is combined with the modern. It seems to really touch that collective unconsciousness that still seems to be within the human fiber, and people are really moved by it.
I'm not surprised. It's a bit at an angle to what you would think of a traditional Mass as being, but it seems to encompass a great deal that the traditional Mass might not address at all.
Yeah, and between the two of us, we weren't looking to, you know, we had this commission that was the template, but we really wanted to just utilize the template and not sort of, it was never intended to be a religious service, and it was always a musical form, like a Bach's B minor Mass. He used the Latin text. Now that wasn't going to work for us. I mean, because that would have been an easy out. Just say Celtic Mass for the sea, you know, use the Latin text. And I mean, there's a fellow in California that's actually done that. But where's the Celtic, and where's the creatures of the sea? Where's the story? So it became really important for us to look deeper than that. And we thought, well, maybe we should try to do it in Gaelic. And we thought, well, that's kind of silly because we're not Gaelic speakers ourselves. And then it restricts people being able to sing it, because it's a difficult language. All of a sudden you're learning a second language if you're a choir. And Alexander Carmichael did me this great favor by already doing it, metrically translating it in English. So make it really easy to put it all together. And so we use one little Gaelic bit, and that's in the credo, and that would be the actual Our Father, which is Crechem Anagium. And so and that's all about reaffirmation of faith. So I guess in a larger sense, it sort of tries to touch on spirituality, not in a formalistic religious setting, but again, to encourage people through empowerment to find it within themselves, to get involved or make changes, so we can move on.
You know, the very act of creating a Mass not for humans, a Mass for the creatures of the sea, that in itself is a huge step out into the broad world with a religious perspective, isn't it? And that must be quite unusual. I mean, that you would have a Mass that is dedicated to the non-human world. Mm. Is that right?
Yeah.
And with that, that's where the whole first and second readings come in, because the idea of, okay, so we do have all of this sort of 5 movement structure that Scott talked about, but now how do we actually tell the story about the creatures? So that's when the first and second reading come into play. So the lines in the first reading is, I spoke the sea, the whale-haunted sea. So this was an opportunity for the oceans and the creatures of the oceans to call out to the humans and say, okay, here we are, you're going to pay attention to us. And then I found this old text that was based on an old epic poem on the voyage of Bran, and is supposed to be the Druid response to the epic poem, where they respond by saying, "Original sin has not touched me." And I thought, well, that also applies to the creatures of the sea. They were here long before religion ever entered the picture. And so they're calling out to us and saying, you of the faith, you that propose that you have this faith, original sin didn't touch us. Original sin touched you, but you're destroying us. What's that all about? And so then we found this little piece of music called the Scotch Song for Attracting Seals. And it's the little musical interlude between the first reading and the second reading. So the whole second reading kind of gives an opportunity to build on identifying the creatures of the sea, trying to give them a voice and let them talk to us. And that's sort of the thrust of the whole piece right in there in the first and second reading.
That's quite wonderful. Who's the fragrant maiden of the sea?
Who is she?
I don't know.
Who
Thou
is
art
she?
full of graces.
Isn't it? Be thine hand on my rudder's helm. And fishermen, sailors, anybody who's associated with the water would be crooning a prayer like that if they're out fishing or out on the water. I'm sure, Don, you're a sailor. There's been many a nights in a storm when you've, evoked some form of help.
Well, you'll be amused. One of the things I've heard from other recreational sailors is that every season there's one occasion in which you say, "Lord, get me out of this and I will never come out here again."
Exactly.
It's a more terrified, maybe a more terrified than reverent moment, It's been enormously successful. It's now become a best-selling classical album, and you've had performances where? All over.
Well, yeah, all around. There's quite a few people in Germany who've taken it on. There's plans to have it done next year in Bonn at Ocean Stay on the 8th of June, and so it's a big commitment for a choral director to take it on. And as long as the choir takes it on and they're going to learn it, then the instrumental side of it is, in some ways, is not all that difficult. But the singing can be. It's a long blow for a choir. It's 45 minutes of pretty well non-stop singing. There's a few little instrumental bits in between, but it's taken on. It's been performed over 60 times.
Has it?
Yeah.
And in Carnegie Hall, among other places.
Carnegie Hall, that's right. We did a shortened version of it in Carnegie Hall, and that was quite a thrill.
Well, it must have been.
Yeah, my anecdote is, I wasn't conducting it, I was playing it. Pierre Perron was conducting it, and he rallied 150 singers to go to New York and perform it. And I was so busy playing the guitar that just doing my part and being my orchestral responsible self, and then all of a sudden at the end, the last little bit, it's pretty easy. I could just sort of look around and say, "Hey, this is Carnegie Hall. This is kind of cool." Because before that, it was just get down and do the gig.
Isn't it? Totally focused on it.
That's right. Doesn't matter where I am. I'm going to play as best. And then, I can look up, and that was really a big thrill.
Must be an odd experience to have written it, but not to be conducting it, to be performing in it and not conducting it.
Yeah, it's great. I like to. I take a lot of pleasure in hearing what another person would do at tempos and dynamics, and that's the way they'd feel about it. And any time that I've been in the orchestral situation and someone else is conducting it, there has not been a conflict, and I'm just as well to let them go with it, because there's been many performances where I haven't played it and it's just been done whatever happens. I'm not even there to hear it, so who knows how it goes. So the tempos are all worked out and the recording is there, so someone can hear the way I did it in the studio, the tempos that I took. But if they wanted to take it a little faster or a little slower, it's pretty flexible music that way.
And you're making room for the creativity of another person. Or
Exactly,
another group
yeah,
of
which
people
is kind of exciting in a way.
It's one of the joys of the performing arts, isn't it? That you know, that you can have the same piece and it can be a play or it can be an opera or it can be a musical performance, and it's a different thing. It's a different thing every time it's done.
Yeah.
Even if you're doing it again with the same people,
yeah.
it's still a different thing.
Now, I've conducted it a couple of times. It's a ball to conduct. It's a lot of fun. The Celtic Mass is fun to conduct. It really is. I just get up there, and that's my way of doing it. And a couple of years back, I had a choir of Cape Bretoners, and that was a real thrill. Just after conducting it, not since '93, and to come back after all those years and have another throw on it, it was a ball.
And a Celtic chorus, that one.
Yeah.
A chorus made up of Celts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a Celtic choir.
Tell me about the commissioning process, because you mentioned, you've mentioned before that it came out of your experience with the octet. Well, let's go back to the octet.
Yeah.
What was the octet?
The octet was an 8-piece group comprised of a string quartet and then 4 Celtic traditional players. And it was an interesting project. It was spearheaded by CBC, and we made a recording, and it was quite successful, and people really liked it. But it was really hard to keep it together, to schedule all those musicians together. So I was of the mind, okay, I'm just going to let this go. I had other things I wanted to do, and it was really a nice creative project. But CBC wanted to, let's try to keep this octet thing going. And a man by the name of Mark Andrew Cardiff said, well, look, I'm going to see if we can get CBC to commission you to write a Celtic Mass for the creatures of the sea, and the instrumentation will be basically the octet. And I thought, oh, that sounds like an interesting idea. And I said, okay, well, let's make the octet a 10-tet, because I want to add a bass and I want to add a harp. So rather than 4 and 4, let's have 5 and 5. Okay. But so I just beefed up the ensemble ever so slightly, and that was the impetus of the commission. Came out of that sound of the string quartet and the Celtic players.
Where do you think Mark Andrew came up with? Did Mark Andrew come up with the idea of a mass for the sea?
Yeah, for the creatures of the sea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he was getting married, and the priest that he was working with, getting ready for the wedding, was interested in Celtic Christianity. So it came out of that. In fact, this priest, whoever he was, Mark Andrew, wanted him to actually do the text. And so Scott would do the music, this man would do the text, and that was all fine and good. But he went AWOL. He wouldn't return a phone call for 3 months. And so Scott had a piece of music. We had a small commission to write this thing, and we had a family to feed, and how do you put it all together? And that's how I came into the picture, because I just, out of sheer tenacity and concern that this thing was just going to not happen and we would be faced with living off the money with no piece of music written, I went out then and put the text together.
Best thing ever happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Had you ever done anything like that before?
No.
Again? Have you done it again?
I did a wee bit with another piece of music that Scott did, Three That Seek My Heart, similar origins of text. No, but I've always been interested in folk music. I used to play in coffee houses and folk music, and one of the things I really enjoyed about folk music was the varieties. Like, you'd have a song and then you see all these variations. So I always had a sort of a bit of a nose for searching that kind of thing out. But no, this was basically a one-off.
Yeah, but you've been a full, flat-out partner. I mean, that's the other thing I wanted to touch on, is that this is a partnership over a career.
Yes.
You know, where Scott's been, in a sense, out front, but Scott would not be free to do that if he didn't have you doing so much of it. Unusually, in this case, the research,
yeah.
But usually the management, a whole bunch of that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And the fulfillment for the recordings, and you know.
Yeah, well, early on we looked at what I could do financially and what he could do financially, and I figured, well, it'd be more cost effective if I could get him to work more, and then I could just pick up the back end. And so that's the way it's sort of basically been, and it's sort of been an entrepreneurial creative career, and we've been fortunate. We've raised 2 kids with that, and now they're off doing their own thing.
But it hasn't been easy.
No, it's never easy doing a creative career.
Yeah.
Because it's you wanna stay true to the creativity, but you still have to be pragmatic. So you're always in that struggle, and the arts in Canada is not easy. The funding isn't terrific, but you know, Scott's got the talent and the tenacity, and we've got the ability to pull it off. And there we, you know.
It takes a remarkable combination of qualities, though, doesn't it? Because you do have to have all the artistic stuff. It's got to be good, or it's not going to sell. You know, and nobody's going to want to hear it. But if you're only a terrific musician, that doesn't really form the basis for a life, does it? Yeah.
Well, no, not necessarily, because I mean, we figured it takes 2. You know, you got it's. I don't envy a lot of the musicians that are trying to do it themselves. You know, both be the creative and the business, because there's so little time left for the creative once you've dealt with the business. And now with the internet and social media and all of that pressure, that takes up way much more time. I don't know where creative people actually get the time to spend the hours creating, because it does take hours. And something like the size of the Celtic Mass for the Sea, it takes an enormous amount of hours. And those hours are dedicated, and you can't be out doing other work while you're trying to compile and compose a piece of that length.
Well, it's often occurred to me, I mean, Scott, you have a tremendously adaptable talent. You do a whole range of different things, and you do it in whole different styles. I mean, you do arranging and conducting and teaching, and you do it jazz, and you do blues, and you do Celtic, and you do flat out. Well, your symphony that was based on a palindrome is a pretty experimental piece of work, right? And I've often thought to myself that probably part of the reason that you're able to take such risks is that you've got the sort of the rock solid foundation of Jennyfer's underpinning of the whole thing. Is that true?
Oh yeah, and I have Jennyfer there to. Well, the analogy I draw with the way it works with us, it's a train. There's an engine and a caboose, and Jennyfer's the engine and the caboose, and I'm the cars in between. So she comes up with, you know, an idea or something, and then, you know, and then she says, "Okay, Scott, make it happen," you know, and then I'll make it happen. But then it's like birthing a baby. You have to take care of it afterwards, and then she's there at the administrative level to do that kind of work. So that's sort of the analogy I see with us.
I was also struck by the fact that this is a commission, and who commissions musical work in this country?
Oh, it could be any number of, you know, ensembles, and it's, you know, if you can make a good connect between whether it's an orchestra or an individual or an artist that wants a new piece of music and they want a new piece. Oh yeah, there's a lot of commissions that happen.
See, I asked that partly because when I thought of being a writer, it was a revolutionary thought to me, because in my day, the definition of a writer was that he or she was British and dead. It didn't seem to be a career that a Canadian could pursue. And I would have thought that a composer would be a similar kind of thing. If you'd say, you know, in high school in Halifax, I'm going to be a composer, and everybody else is saying, well, I'm going to be a, you know, doctor, a lawyer, a railroad engineer, whatever it is, that must have seemed a very eccentric thing to do.
Well, it was kind of a work in progress as to what I wanted to do. Like, there was key points in my life where I wasn't sure if I was going to be a musician or not, but I was good at it. I could play, and I wasn't really composing a lot, but I was playing a lot. And I realized that, well, I have a BA in mathematics, and I had to work hard at that, you know, and then I was playing music at the same time, paying for the tuition to finish the mathematics, and the music was just easy. I would just show up and play, you know, no problem. And then I thought, well, what if I went to school in music? Added that academe to basically not academic, playing blues and not too much jazz, but I wanted to get into jazz, and that meant some study and learning that side of it. So that's how okay, this is what I'm going to do. This makes sense now. I'm going to be a natural musician, but also a studied musician too. And that I came up to that realization later on when I was 22, 21. And then, okay. So it made sense at that point.
But the composition, it kind of grows naturally out of, if you're doing blues and jazz, you're improvising, you're already in a sense creating, but
Exactly.
you're creating on the fly, right?
Yeah, a lot of improvising, which exactly it's composing within certain parameters, and so the composition was okay. I can come up with stuff that I can attribute to myself. I remember the first time I wrote a simple little tune. I thought, hey, that is mine. It's reminiscent of other things, but I haven't heard it before. So I'll just have to put my name on it if someone comes along and says, wait a minute, that's mine. Oh. It's actually, what was the saying? It's better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Any idea how many tunes you have composed, even if we were, say, restricting ourselves to short things, fiddle tunes, that kind of thing? But any idea how many of those would be?
I don't know.
Hundreds.
It would certainly be hundreds,
Yeah,
wouldn't it?
there'd be lots there, little fiddle tunes, and at this point in my life, I don't have a big creative project on the go, but I'm constantly composing.
Your canons a day.
Yeah, I write canons, mostly 12-tone canons, and it's just keeping the brain ready and keeping the chops always ready, because canons are great because it's counterpoint, and I really like line and melody. I'm a tune guy. So
one of the strengths of these pieces too, these big pieces, is that they are very melodic, many lines.
yeah, that's what, earworms in my head. I have melodies that, so I'm composing all the time, and so it's really important to me. I love it. It's a challenge.
Well, and by now it is who you are, right?
Yeah.
You could no more not compose than you could not breathe and still get along, right?
Right.
And Jen, you way back when, you also had an environmental background.
I did. I went to the art college and was in their environmental planning program for 2.5 years. I didn't finish. But the big key interest that I had while I was there was the ecology component of the program, and spent some time in England working with some of the founders of the most ecology paper, the Blueprint for Survival, that was written in the late 60s. So ecology and environment have been sort of really important to me through the years. So this was a delight in a way for me to get my hands on this, finding all of this ancient text, and then being able to pull it and piece it all together with my ecology interests.
There's something kind of miraculous when a piece like this comes together out of so many strands in your mutual experience, And I remember you talking about the singing sands, which come up in the piece too. Tell me about that again.
Well, the singing sands, that's really, we were in Chimney Corner up in Cape Breton, and going for a walk on the beach, and all of a sudden the sands are going, it's like, oh! And this guy said, what, it's in B flat in Chimney Corner? And then in some of the reading I did, they talked about Cenorius Sands. I mean, I thought that was just kind of a hot phenomenon in certain beaches that we've got around PEI in Nova Scotia. I didn't sort of know that it actually had a name, but then came to find out they were called Cenorius Sands, and only certain beaches around the world do have Cenorius Sands. And I thought it made for a great moment, because if you take the idea of these singing sands and you take this little pamphlet that Scott talked about, Understanding the Mass, and one of the opening statements in this little booklet was a Mass is a mood-altering experience, and music is used to alter the mood. And I thought, wow, this is great. And then I found this little text of, now lay thine ear against the golden sand. And I'm thinking, oh, the sands are singing, and we're laying our ears against the golden sand. And it's a mood-altering experience, and what a great opportunity to create a transition between the upper world and the underworld, which again is very Celtic in its mythology, where you have the whole world of the Selkies and the underworld and the undersea world. And so we just kind of sort of had this vision of bringing people through their daily lives under the sea, under the sand, and then into the ocean, and start telling our story. So it was really, really neat when all of these kind of things came together.
There's a in the Celtic sort of view of things, it seems to me that in many ways today we look at the world in a very mechanical kind of way, as a kind of a machine with all kinds of intricately related parts. But it seems that the Celtic tradition has the whole world being alive. And not a mechanical relationship, but a sort of a biological relationship, or a life relationship of some kind.
Could be, yeah, could very well.
Yeah. And like the Mass seems to me to be full of that kind of thing. That there are living things all over the world and all over the place, not just traditional things. The singing sands almost are a living thing too.
Yeah. Oh, very much, very much. So yeah, and it's really neat. We just ran into somebody the other day who took their nephew or niece up to Chimney Corner, and they said, look, rub your feet on the sand, and then, whoop, yeah, see? That's what Scott uses in his Celtic Mass for the sea that we just heard.
And you can make quite long sounds with it too. Like if you take your hand and pass it over, you can get a long moaning sound out of them. And then,
And the sands on the south side of Sable Island are really good singing sands. When we went there, better than Chimney Corner.
Really?
Gives you a good sound, and it's really easy to get it too.
It's a good set at Basin Head on the other side on Prince Edward Island, just facing Chimney Corner, or all across the.
Oh, is that right?
Straight, yeah.
Oh, really?
Well, I think that's where I first became aware of them, was in PEI.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we're calling what we think of as singing sands or our Cenorius Sands, or the geologists have specific beaches in mind, but they make sound.
They make a sound.
Yes, and it's quite miraculous. I mean, you feel like something has been revealed to you.
Yeah, the beach is talking to you.
See the beach is talking to you. Well, there it is. There's that eminence of life inside the whole thing. And I guess the final question I want to ask is: it seems to me when I listen to the Mass, and I listen to the Mass in the context of the world that I'm living in, and I have that, I think, very Celtic sense of the world as being alive, not like a machine, but a living thing, and it seems to me that there's an echo of the great act of creation in the Mass itself. That the Mass itself, is a creation, but really speaks to creation. That it really is just filled with creativity and wonder. Does it still seem that way to you?
Well, I still like it. So, I guess so. I've sort of told people before that I find the excitement of creating something new by me is like, it's not really by me. It's already out there, and I managed to look in the right direction to find it. And the way Jennyfer put the script together, I kind of think that the same thing. Like she was in the right place at the right time. All those books in Dalhousie at the right place, and she was there at the right time. So in some ways she was very much a conduit to these poems and things that were, and then the Marjorie Kennedy Fraser melodies, it was all there. It was just a matter of finding it. So yeah, it is a celebration of creativity.
Yeah, and it's not just you. It's part of the, in a sense, it's the world acting through you, or it feels that way.
It feels that way. Of course, if it wasn't for her, that it wouldn't have happened. But it did happen, and she found it, and then I found it, and if any of the tunes that I've come up with, even these little 12-tone canons, all of a sudden I find something in this little one-pager that's it speaks to me. It tells me what to do next.
In a sense, you're holding yourself in a state of readiness.
Yes.
Right? And if
In
you
a
are
way.
ready,
Yeah.
then when something's ready to happen, you're there for it.
Yeah, and then at least be there to consider it. Sometimes I'll find things that I wouldn't want to share with anybody. but that's where we make choices. Jennyfer made choices. She had all of those words. She chose those pages. Those were the ones that we are left with. And I made choices of how to spin that music off to make those lines. But I was ready to see them and hear them, and then I chose that one and that one. There's a lot of things in the Mass that I didn't use and cast them aside.
A lot of things that you had gathered, but they weren't in the end.
They
what you
weren't
needed.
in the end used.
Scott Macmillan and Jennyfer Brickenden, composer and librettist of the magnificent Celtic Mass for the Sea. If you enjoyed this interview, you may also want to look at our interviews with painter Robert Bateman and poet Brian Brett. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.